Hi everyone, welcome to Monstrosity in Speculative Fiction Part 2. This, if you didn't realize, this is a part 2. This is the second part to the Monstrosity in Speculative Fiction Part 1, which has already been streamed. Yeah, streamed. Definitely check that out afterwards if you didn't know. And also thank you to Christy. Christy is not here, but Christy helped kind of get the panel idea, had panelists in mind as well. So Christy kind of made my part of this much easier. If you don't know who I am, my name is Lily. I'm the moderator for the panel, and I'm kind of the face behind Utopia State of Mind. So now we will have our authors introduce themselves, tell us about their books, and then we're going to chat about monsters, all about monsters. Skyla, do you want to start?
Yeah, so my name is Skyla Arndt. I'm so stoked to be here because I love monsters, so this is a perfect panel for me. My book, Together We Rot, is a young adult horror romance, if you want to call it that. It's about a young girl who is searching for answers about her mother's disappearance. And she has to make a tentative alliance with her former best friend in exchange for hiding him from his cult leading parents. Essentially, the two of them think his family has something to do with her mother's disappearance. And then not only that, but if they don't get to the bottom of it soon, he might be next. So lots of monsters, like spooky, like hijinks, Scooby Doo like hijinks, and fun stuff like that. But yeah, it's like a little horror romance type of thing.
Awesome. So I can go next. Hi, everyone. My name is Kritika H. Rao. I'm the author of The Surviving Sky. I have my book here somewhere, right here. And I don't know if you can see it with all the blurry. You can't. It's fine. Uh, but The Surviving Sky is an epic science fantasy. It's the story about this husband and wife duo who are trying to save their floating plant city from crashing into jungle storms. And they're trying to save their marriage as well while that's happening. Monsters make this like interesting appearance in this book, in this series, in the sense of like you have these jungle storms where nothing survives at all except for these like massive, basically like ginormous creatures, and they're the only things that kind of survive down there. And the wife protagonist is trying to figure out how they survive and nobody else can, and she's trying to look for a way back for life to return to Earth. So yeah, I mean, I feel like the monsters in my story, even though they're super large, are really kind of subtle, and it'll be interesting to see, how that kind of blends in with everybody else's version of monsters.
So, hey y'all, my name is Erin, and I wrote Jackal. Jackal is it follows a young Black woman named Liz who returns to her hometown in the Rust Belt. She's been away for many, many years for many very good reasons. But she comes back for her best friend's wedding. At that wedding, her best friend's young daughter vanishes. And so this massive manhunt begins for this little girl. And as the search gets deeper and deeper, Liz realizes that not only does this seem very familiar to her, this has been happening over and over and over again for generations in her small town. And now it is up to her to figure out what's really going on before it's all too late. And the reason why these girls have just kind of been pushed under the radar, so to speak, is that they're all young Black girls. So in writing Jackal, my monster is basically the thing that may or may not be in the woods that is taking these young girls. And I'm really excited to talk about it. It was one of the, I have to dance very carefully over spoilers, but it is one of the, when I do get to talk about it, one of my favorite parts of the book that I so rarely get to chat about because it's so linked to, the grand reveal in the end.
Well, sorry. I want to start off with just a basic question about monsters. And so it's just basically, what does monstrosity mean to you? And also, what did you think of this theme while drafting? Because sometimes I feel like themes kind of emerge when you're drafting or you're thinking about them beforehand. So what was swirling in your head about of everything monstrous?
Erin has such a good point about not wanting to spoil things while you're talking. It's so easy. It's like I have to control it. But yeah, basically, so this book I was thinking about the term of like with as far as monstrosity goes, like like a metamorphosis sort of thing of slowly turning into something that you don't recognize. But for this book, I didn't see it as a bad thing necessarily. What was bad in the beginning was, Elwood, one of the main characters, he has this with his parents. They're very controlling, very abusive, and they have very strict, expectations for him. And as he's starting to turn, it's a way. It may be more of a monstrous thing for them because they can't keep him so docile and controlled. But it's kind of coming into yourself in a coming of age sort of way. So it's like this sense of just self, like unrestrained self. But yeah, so for me, it's like it's a kind of like a positive thing as it relates to like his own character arc.
Mhm. I can go. So for me, I knew that I always wanted to have a monster because I'm obsessed with like folklore and just like how we as a culture sometimes make up stories in order to answer these deeply unanswerable questions. And looking at Jackal is set in the Rust Belt in like around 2017, and there's a whole big pot of stuff happening then. And I'm like, if I had to make a monster, what would that look like to try and talk about these questions that, like, that I had such trouble dealing with? And I would say like they kind of came together. I started off very much like saying, okay, I want to write a story about a monster. But so often as I was drafting, the monstrosity, so to speak, just kind of leaked into all the other aspects of the book, into the characters, into the town, into like our fears and anxieties. And also the monster in Jackal is very much linked to the monster of the other, like whoever the other happens to be today, and how dangerous that can be when you are cast as the other against your will.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if my answer is particularly different from any of these. In the Surviving Sky, for one thing, the monsters, so to speak, are called yakshas, and yakshas in Hindu philosophy and Hindu mythology are jungle spirits. And my interpretation of them was very much to cast them as these giant creatures, and that honestly came because like I love Jurassic Park, and that was a little bit of an ode to Jurassic Park. I'm like, this is awesome, and like I'm gonna have big monsters in there because I can. So I did, and um, so that was like the fan part of me, honestly. Um, but in the story as well, like there's quite a bit of otherness that the yakshas themselves are kind of cast into because they are big, they are alien, they are, nobody knows very much about them for all of these people and for civilization that exists above the planet. Nobody cares about them because the jungle itself is othered. In many ways, the planet itself is othered, and the yakshas being that natural component of the planet and environment are simultaneously othered because people just think of them as very separate to themselves. So the Surviving Sky and the Rages trilogy in itself like is very intertwined with with climate, and honestly even that was one of those things that kind of crept into it. Nature and climate kind of crept into it, and it's interesting when you kind of think about um, otherness in with respect to monstrosity, because I think oftentimes like we can in our own world, like we tend to other people, different races, different cultures, all of that. um, but I think we also other like our planet and environment and things that we don't necessarily think of as living things or living creatures or living systems, when in fact all of those are living systems and we are a part of those living systems. So monsters in some way in the Surviving Sky has different ripple effects. Even Ahelia and Aravan, who are the two protagonists, they are so different from each other. In some ways, they are monsters to each other as well. And if you read The Surviving Sky, you'll see that both of them are incredibly flawed, incredibly human, and incredibly wrong in so many ways that they can often be monsters to each other, even though they are in a committed marriage relationship. So that intertwining of being close, whereas you can also be separate, and I think all of those to me combine monstrosity. Even though, like, at a very basic level, for me, it started off as like, oh my god, cool, big, giant animals. So
Yeah, I think that's a theme that I wanted to talk more about. So I'm glad that you gave me that segue, because I want to talk more, yeah, about the monsters reflecting, or monsters not only in entities as well, but also within ourselves and everything that sort of reflect fears and also other things that they will reflect. And interpreting that theme within the context of your book, I feel like Rithika kind of just encapsulated that so well. But is there anything you want to start us off by adding?
um sorry, were you talking to me about?
Yeah, well, because I feel like your question was like the perfect segue to my
Uh-huh.
next question, which was,
Yeah,
yeah, about reflections, like monsters reflecting fears and etc.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't want to spoil anything for readers who haven't read The Surviving Sky, but during the course of the book, Ahilya and Ravan, as they kind of, one of the mysteries in the book is why their magic isn't working, as well as it should be, because that magic is essential to surviving in the sky. Like without that magic, they essentially crash to jungle storms. And given that these creatures are the only thing that survive in jungle storms, inevitably they end up questioning why these creatures survive. And there's a thread that kind of ties all of this together. So that reflection of kind of seeing yourself, in these creatures who you've kind of alienated, you don't really care very much about them. Um, here's what I find interesting about the examination and the inspection of monsters when it comes to speculative fiction or any kind of fiction really, is how I feel like when you start examining something as something that from the very get-go has been set up as being different and separate from you, and over the course of narrative you kind of start to see how it is not that different. I think you come from point A to point B at the end of the story, which can like illuminate so much of humanity around you. Oftentimes we look at monsters, again, as I keep using that word, as alien and it's often inhuman, right? Like I think that's why we don't think of them as human monsters. They're a whole different thing. But there's an element of humanity that you kind of discover when you make that connection and you make that reach. Whether it is in understanding that we all have like similar anxieties or similar fears or whatever that is, or it is an understanding that you are one part of a huge whole, right? So I think these are some of the thematic things that I kind of like explored in The Surviving Sky, when you kind of start off with a very, very different perspective of even like who the two protagonists are and how they exist in this world versus, the jungle being below unsurvivable and this, city floating above it, which is all that survival is, and how those two kind of merge together. So, yeah, I want to say like monsters really, this is like a far more, um, just it's a far bigger question, I think. But I think monsters really allow you to make that reach, which I think um, it's a beautiful, cool literary and narrative device, which I don't necessarily know if I thought of it like that when I was drafting.
I would say for me, and in Jackal and in other works I've done, I think that I find that monsters, yes, they can reflect our fears, but they also reflect like our like darkest desires, like our anger, our rage, our lust, things that we just don't feel comfortable usually expressing otherwise. They can also, I'm thinking of, I also have a short story that's about mermaids. It's called La Siren, and that then there the monstrous is like just your body changing like through puberty, like how your body becomes foreign to you during that like massive event. And so at least for I think I don't know, at least for me, I feel like my monsters, they're a really good way to kind of pull up and talk about and show these other aspects of our characters. And in Jackal, again, parsing very carefully to not spoil too much, the whatever is out in the woods starts to, in her words, quote unquote, get into Liz, the main protagonist, like to get into her head. And we see her kind of taking on some of these like monstrous qualities of this thing that's, kind of lurking out there that she is hunting, and then therefore she also feels like is hunting her at the exact same time. And in doing so in Jackal, it was just very exciting for me to kind of just slowly, pour in, like a cook, like a chef, just stirring it in every so often as we're going along in the book. Because another huge theme in Jackal is like anger, and anger as a Black woman, and how it is somehow both our superpower and like what can kill us at the exact same time. And it was just, there's so many scenes, going all the way to the end, where we see Liz become just become a bit more of the master of her rage, so to speak, and that it get, not too spoilery, like that it does get a little out of control at some points, and you are questioning, like, hey, is that okay, or is that not, or but this is totally justified, but um so no, I am very much up for that kind of reader experience. If you don't feel deeply conflicted by what my characters are doing, that I'm not doing my job right.
Yeah, I definitely agree with like what Aaron said about like it reflecting your innermost desires that maybe you don't want to vocalize. For Together We Rot, specifically with Elwood, like I said, parental abuse is a really big part of the book. And this idea of, having given his power sort of to his father and wanting it back, and being so afraid of what his parents are going to do to him, but then they are afraid of this the main monster of the book, and his desire is wanting to be something to be feared, or wanting to have the power back. Um, so whether he realizes it or not in the main part of the book, it's kind of, yeah, it's like what Aaron said, like a very innermost desire that you don't really want to vocalize, but you definitely want to have, like you want to take that power back. So yeah, a lot of it just for me, it relates to like the abuse cycle, and wanting to take control of your own emotions and power.
Yeah, I want to go and talk a little bit about some of the themes that, two books or books delve into a little bit more, just because I feel like a lot of the things that you all are saying kind of are that I really want to chat about in a little bit more depth in terms of some books. And the first one that I have is about the surviving sky and jackal, because I think that both of your books are really invested in looking at the past and how it explores the importance of the past within the book, and also its connection to power and memory. I think that those themes really evolve throughout the book, and I'd love to know from both of you about navigating the relationship with the past, power, and memory. All the big themes together.
Uh, wow, that's a tough one. Skylar, you want to go first so I can think about think a little bit about how to
I'll go.
answer.
All right. Um,
Oh,
so
sorry,
Jack,
Erin, my bad.
no worries. So Jackal, just to put a little bit of context, is set in my real life hometown. Like, I actually grew up there. Um, and it's set in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And Johnstown, Pennsylvania has a fascinating history. When I started writing Jackal, I put it in a like nondescript, like Rust Belt town, but as I was revising, things just kept getting more and more specific, to the point where it became distracting. Like, I was like, it's in a Rust Belt town that had a really bad tragedy in the 1890s involving a flood. And like, finally, we just had like me and my editor had a chat. We're like, let's just set it there because we're getting really really close. So Johnstown is a steel mill town. It had a very thriving like steel mill culture. Um, and I used to know the dates so well. Now my brain's a little fuzzy, but I believe it's like in the 1890s, there was the Johnstown flood. Let me try to summarize this as best I can. Johnstown is literally in a valley. And about 14, and it's in these mountains, in the Appalachian Mountains. So 14 miles above Johnstown is the South Fork Dam. The South Fork Dam, it used to be a reservoir. It had different ownership over the years, and by the 1890s, it had become like a hunting lodge for like the one percenters, like, you know, the Carnegies and the Fricks would like summer at the South Fork Dam. And because it became like a vacation spot, it was no longer maintained as a dam anymore. And including, I think at one point it was discovered many, many years later that they actually lowered the dam to make it easier to get like carriages and stuff across it. And that's important because in May 1890, the dam burst after like a week of rain and just disrepair. It burst, and it was in the middle of the day, so like no one could see this coming, and like a metric tons of water and debris just hurtled the 14 miles down the mountain and hit Johnstown and like completely decimated the town. And then because of it's in a very Johnstown's a very remote location, and just the time period, it knocked out all communications. So people had to literally walk or go on horseback to neighboring towns to spread the news that this had happened. So help really didn't arrive until the next day. It's just, and it's crazy, like it's absolutely insane to think about something like that happening. Up until I believe Hurricane Katrina, it was the largest like disaster that happened on U.S. soil, and it's the whole everything about it is just this microcosm of at least what I felt for me has been happening in the US over and over again. I'd argue that there's unfortunately nothing new under the sun. Like you have people vacationing in somebody else's home and then destroying it. You have the upper class kind of really bearing down on the working classes. And especially it's something where you can't make this up. I'm like, Johnstown was making the one, like they were making the money for the Carnegies and the Fricks, like they were the ones who were bringing in all their wealth. And so thinking about that cycle of like classism, and then also again trying not to reveal too much of the book, there's something else that happened in Johnstown that's not as public. Thinking about that cycle when it comes to racism, I just feel like the past is so important to understanding everything that's happening in the present. And especially when it comes to pulling all together, like with my story and the missing girls and the monstrosity and the thing that may or may not be in the woods, like one of the themes that, you know, that the monster in the woods kind of comes to represent is like a hidden past, like not knowing about the past, and it kind of just kind of lurking out of the corner of your eye, and you deciding whether or not you want to turn and look at it or whether you just want to kind of like keep it in the corner. Right? I often described it when we were trying to nail down some of the wording. I'm like, it's kind of like when you know there's a mouse in your apartment and you're just like, am I going to deal with this? Am I? And I'd argue that there's a certain amount of denial one must have when you know you have a mouse. And then there's a certain amount of action that you must take when you know you have a mouse, you know?
It's so interesting kind of saying that that's, you know, the way that you've kind of explored past is that there is something, do we look at it, do we not look at it, you know, from that perspective. In The Surviving Sky, it's a little different. I want to say it's actually almost entirely opposite to that, in that in Surviving Sky, there is a class of people whose histories were actively erased. And because the world itself is like frankly dystopian in some ways, like they had to, all of humanity had to ascend, you know, from the planet and kind of survive above the planet because the planet itself was basically killing them with jungle storms. Civilization evolved, in a manner of speaking, to keep survival at forefront, right? So anything that didn't actively contribute to survival was pushed aside, and over time was forgotten, was erased, was, you know, power structures evolved in terms of people who could do the magic to keep, you know, civilization afloat. And everybody else, which is the majority of the population who can't do the magic because they're not directly contributing to survival, like their histories, etc., they were kind of erased. And the way it is, it's like, I think because you kind of see the perspective of both the husband who can do the magic and belongs to the upper class, so to speak, and the wife who cannot do any of the magic and belongs to, you know, the class who is basically erased. You kind of see both their perspectives when it comes to survival, and whether or not that erasure was right, or, you know, when resources were few and limited as society kind of evolved, is that way of thinking correct? Because the survival and power and memory, all of these themes are so intertwined within Surviving Sky. But it's also about validity and who gets to decide what is valid, right? Like, whose perspective do we really listen to in terms of this is correct, this is what survival must be. And at the center of it is also the question of whose survival and what survival means, right? Survival is not just necessarily, because this is based on Hindu philosophy and Hindu mythology very much, Hindu philosophy really. The themes of birth and rebirth are, embedded within the story. So when you say whose survival, you're not necessarily talking only a survival in terms of your life. You're also thinking of survival in terms of, your past, your history, your stories, right? These are things that create a life. These are things that create a civilization. So when you actively go around erasing, one of these things, like what does that do to survival and erasure and power structures? So there is all of this kind of tied within it, and then you see these creatures who are basically these monsters who have survived, who have been forgotten in a manner of speaking. They have been erased from histories with not that much information, but they're still there and they're still surviving, right? So it's very much like, well, they exist. How have you actively managed to erase that as well, even though it exists? And I think that question is very much something that I want to say, a lot of cultures grapple with even now, right? India was colonized for like 200 years by Britishers, and a lot of our histories have been, erased, and a lot of, our stories can only be found in English translations because the original native languages have been destroyed, right? So, but they still exist. They exist in memory. They exist in, stories that, I've heard from my grandparents, and they've heard, and it's kind of passed down generation to generation. So I want to say that culture and civilization and, the yakshas, as they personify a past and an immortality, almost like they exist, even if they're not necessarily captured in the same form that that everything else is kind of captured within. So all of these things are kind of married, and I use that term deliberately because the protagonists are married, but all of these things are, married within the Surviving Sky. Um, and I don't know if I deliberately sought to, tie all of these things together. I think I always say this, like when I was writing the book, and this is most often my process, is like there's so many things that I'm interested in and I find them really cool. And then if I can find a way to kind of tie it all together, then for the most part, it kind of happens on its own. These themes kind of come through discovery as opposed to through planning as much.
I want to also talk about the power systems within Together We Rot and Jackal, because I think that, as Aaron was saying, it ties a little bit into conversations we've had already, but about the way that systems of power contributes to feelings of monstrosity. So from both of your books, how did you use the story and the setting to explore the monster, in quotation marks, as a group?
Yeah, there's so in Elwood's world, it's a very small town, and most of his life he's in a church with it where his father is like the head of church. So there's a lot of religious trauma with him on top of just parental abuse. His father has a title of, they call him the right hand of God, and there's a line in the beginning where he says he basically sees his father and God as this inseparable like being, like they're basically the same in his mind. And his father, he says that I always picture God with my father's face. So he, on top of, just the normal abuse that he faces at home, he goes to church, which is like his the place where he spends most of his time, and he has all of these people in the congregation that basically almost worship his father. They listen to everything he has to say. And in the same, I'm trying not to spoil it. I'm like, in the same regard, like he feels there's like a sense of entrapment that he has to stay on their good side. He has to appeal to them. Um, and in a way, having this be his only world, it kind of feels like a cage around him. And they almost feel like more of like this monstrous entity than, I don't want to say what it is, but eventually when the real monster shows up, it almost feels like they're more of a monstrous entity than this creature, because it's almost like this cage around him at all times. Um, but yeah, just this collective religious and like parental abuse that he faces all the time. That yeah.
Um, I will also say, like, I also think that Jackal is also dealing with a collective, like maybe not religious trauma, but historical trauma, racial trauma, class trauma. Class is a very big thing in my book that I feel like people like skip over. I'd argue that like classism is like the one ism that we are deeply uncomfortable talking about. um, they're all uncomfortable, but classism is like, oof. And with like Jackal, the way like thinking about a collective, about a group, like there's different groups in Jackal. There's like the town itself, there's like the rich part of town, the like the poor part of town, the black part of town, the white part of town. And it was just so interesting to set up all these different groups that I like came to know so well from living there, and realizing how does the monster affect all these different groups, like who believes in what's in the woods and who doesn't, and who is it for, there's like, of course there's a creepy jingle where you're like, here's like a little creepy poem just to keep you up at night, and it's as it repeats through the story you kind of see how it comes up. Like the first time it comes up is Liz's best friend Mel, who is also like an upper class white woman, is like, oh yeah, here's this cute little rhyme I know. And you're like, girl, that's not cute. That's terrifying. And then you also are, when Liz is going to speak to like some of the mothers who've lost their daughters, a lot of them don't talk about it. It's like, oh no, 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 we don't talk about the thing in the woods. And I just found it so fascinating to think about how monstrosity moves through different groups. How do people either dismiss the monster or try to ignore the monster, or obviously by the end, how do we take down the monster? And for me, that like just making it something, quote unquote abstract, helped me with these larger themes of the book, which is, racism, classism, the trauma of history, the trauma of, then when you're coming down to like, the protagonist, to Liz, the trauma that's in herself. And it was just a really nice, like, like connecting point in all of those moments.
And then for the final pairing, for the sorry, for the surviving sky and together we rot, both of them feature dual perspectives, or like perspectives from multiple people. And so I was interested to know if you could both talk about how you approach both like the themes of monstrosity, but also secrets, which are big themes. Um, how that approach differs because you have multiple people who are kind of like looking at each other, looking at the world and the history and everything like that in different ways, and how you explore that differently within multiple characters.
I'm on mute, so okay, there you go. Um, so in the surviving sky, I think this part actually came quite easy to me, because the two perspectives you see are Ahelia and Aravan, and they are, for one thing, they're married, but they are also very estranged from each other. Um, and Iravan, he's the magical architect, for lack of a better word, but he's the architect who is at the top of his society and has all the power and can do all the magic. And his wife Ahelia has none of the magic, and in her vocation, she's an archaeologist, but she doesn't, is hardly given any kind of importance or validity at all. Um, and because they're estranged from each other, and they kind of through the course of the story trying to return their marriage to a point of stability and love, and trying to return to each other very much. I think secrets kind of came quite easily to embed within it, because for one thing, Eravan, being in a position of power, is not allowed to tell her everything, and he can only tell her things that he's given permission to do so through his counsel and all of that. So that creates a lot of tension within their marriage, of course, because they're married, and you shouldn't have those kinds of huge secrets from each other. But then it turns out that he does have a fairly decent reason for why he does have to keep those secrets. And I think when you kind of look at secrets, and this is just a little bit larger than Surviving Sky, although this is very much part of Surviving Sky. I think when you look at secrets, from the perspective of monstrosity, it's about what is hiding, isn't it? Like that's what a secret is. It's about what you keep to yourself or what somebody else is keeping, to themselves for whatever reasons, XYZ reasons, and we can debate that, another time. But it's about what is hidden, right? And there can be aspects of yourself, and I started this off, way back and during one of the first questions, is how Ahilya and Iravan can be monsters to each other. They can be pretty awful to each other, even though they are trying to return their marriage to a a really nice place. But the way they go about it can be pretty convoluted, and that is partly because they can be monsters to each other because of what they're hiding for whatever reasons, right? That they and in many cases the readers themselves might agree to, because oftentimes from their perspective, you see that the reader knows more information that either one of them does about the other protagonist. Um, so there's an element of sympathy in there as well, because all of us are hiding things, whether we like it or not. We're all keeping secrets. We're all keeping aspects of ourselves hidden, sometimes even from ourselves, because we're guilty or we're ashamed or we don't like them. And acknowledging it can make it real and true, and you don't want it to be true, if as long as it's kind of hidden within your thoughts. So I think it's bringing those hidden things to light and examining them, and then questioning, does that even make me or make this other person a monster? Does it make them human, right? I think in many ways that is a question that the Surviving Sky and the Rages trilogy deals with. It is taking the other and bringing what is hidden, back into light and examining it and saying, huh, maybe this is not something to be so scared of. Maybe this is something to embrace or to, acknowledge or to deal with, instead of hiding it away in this little corner and saying, I never want to look at it because it's awful. Maybe it's something to understand, right? I think in Surviving Sky, there's a huge theme, and because it has a mystery plot, there's a huge theme of like understanding the world around us and understanding people around us. So when it comes to secrets and kind of balancing dual perspectives and monstrosity, I think this is the way I kind of dealt with it, is adding an element of empathy and sympathy through it, even though both the characters can be pretty wretched to each other. But you come away from it thinking they're pretty human, even though they can be pretty awful.
Yeah, with my two characters, it's always funny when you've got dual perspectives, because I always like having them be as opposite from one another as they can be, just because I always think that's funny. But as far as those two go, they have very different. It's very different as far as monstrosity is. With Elwood, you have that very clear sense of there's a supernatural entity, there's a big inward struggle. But with Will, it's harder to see immediately what her monster is. But she's had in the beginning of the book, you see that she's in a way lost her mother. She doesn't know for sure that what's happened to her, but there's a lot of grief there that she doesn't really want to face head on. So she's got this, but it's still there, even if she doesn't want to acknowledge it. It's always kind of looming in the background of everything she does, and it makes it so that she doesn't want to open up to anyone, or she's always constantly afraid of, maybe Elwood is afraid of, with his issue of hurting her, or being, losing himself to that. But she's more afraid of losing him entirely because of this grief that looms over her. But as far as secrets go, it's less that I think that there are any really between them, but she feels there's this rift between them from their broken friendship, where she accused his family of having something to do with his parents, her mother's his parents. She definitely thinks there's more secrets between them that there are. He's, it's like, I swear my family's got nothing to do with this. And she's like, yeah, sure. But even as they're, starting to work together and, have like this like truce, there's he's trying to communicate, what's happening to him. And there is that the rift that they have between each other is this big communication barrier. But it is interesting that there's no like apparent secrets that they're keeping from one another. It's more of just that communication block that it almost makes them struggle to it almost feels like a secret, but it's just them not communicating well.
Yeah, I feel like, yeah, she definitely feels like he has more that he's hiding. He's like, "No, I swear, like, I don't know anything." Um, by the way, I think I forgot to mention this before, but if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box. I want to go back and also ask about a theme or like a connection I was thinking about in terms of monstrosity, which is the connection between monstrosity and loneliness and isolation. I think that those things can often be quite linked. And I was wondering from all of you if you could share your thoughts and how your main characters grapple with the connection between um, all of those, like monstrosity, loneliness, and isolation all together.
Um, so I mean, loneliness and isolation is a huge part of Jackal, and it's something where we see that loneliness echoing through, I think, just about everybody. Like everyone has their moment where you're like, oh, this person or this aspect of their life is deeply lonely. But where the turn comes is, about what about how like that what it's called like the hollowness of it is like, what do you do about it? And like there are some characters who have substance use problems, some characters who spend much of money, um, and there's like one of the one of the characters, like very very early on in the book, we get this kind of like little bell ring moment where she says like, um, nothing good comes of being hateful and hollow, but anger can be useful. And it's like, I really something I really love about okay, this is good, but I'm like stumbling because I'm trying to be so careful not to, spoil too much. But there is this theme of like in that loneliness, in implying a bit of a lacking, and what do we do to soothe that lacking? And there is like a literal, metaphoric and literal consumption in the novel, like, and like what will we give, if someone says, oh, I can cure your loneliness, and it's like, okay, I'll give you my time, I'll give you this, I'll give you a child, like, and to see like where, who keeps pushing that and who kind of backs off and is like, you know what, no, I'm just going to be alone. And that was something, especially by the end, that starts to ring very clearly in, the main, like, I think it's, we can say the three main characters of the book. And seeing, how by the end they all are kind of dealing with this loneliness in a very similar way, but it's about allowing that to make you monstrous or not. And what are, by the end, we have a couple of hints of like what are the other ways of mitigating this loneliness. It's like, how do you reconnect with your community? How do you reconnect with your home? How do you reconnect with your family? But it's something that like it's so tricky because I want to be like, what I want to say is like so obvious, but like such a massive spoiler for the book. But to dance around it a little bit more, it was something I really wanted to talk about because we have Liz, who is, a Black woman in a predominantly white town. That in and of itself is isolating. But you also have people in that town who feel isolated in many different other circumstances. We have Liz, whose presence herself can make people feel isolated. And that was something, it was so difficult to describe to people when they're like, what's that experience like? I'm like, sometimes just the fact that like I exist can be isolating to people, which I just find so fascinating. And a little, it's like adjacent to the loneliness. And I find that fascinating because there's this idea of you being somewhere you're not supposed to be, where it's like you're not supposed, like, there's not supposed to be a thing in the woods. And there is they, very early in the book is implied, it's like, oh, like Black people are like this foreign entity coming into this town, like, oh, they're not supposed to be here. And I find that fascinating, and I like talking about the things that like aren't supposed to be. Like there's slight spoiler, but like there's a mention of in Central Park, there's like obelisks in Central Park. You're like, why? And I find I find things like that fascinating. I mean, it's part of like, why Jackal is called, you know, Jackal, is that I want to talk about the things that quote unquote don't belong. And so therefore are, these isolated moments and people and themes and feelings.
Um, Loneliness and isolation is so embedded in the surviving sky, but I don't think I necessarily call it out as that. It's the kind of thing that, as you're kind of reading the book, you realize just how lonely and isolated Ahilya and Ravan have become from each other. You can see that they obviously care about each other, that, they obviously, think the world of each other in so many ways. And yet, one of the biggest contentions that they have with each other is their ideas on survival are different. And in a world that is ruled by survival, where the main question itself is survival, that can be such a divisive thing between them, right? Like both of them are looking for. Ahilya's entire job is to make sure that Iravan's job becomes redundant because she's trying to change the power structure, right? And Iravan is in the council, and the entire council and the way that the world works is to neglect and to erase Ahilya and her history and her very presence and the people who she represents. So, they're kind of right from the get go, being the kind of people that they are, and the kind of identities that they belong to, they're very much on two separate ends of the spectrum. Yet they're married. They obviously loved each other. They still love each other. Once upon a time, their ideas of the world were similar, which is why they got together in the first place. They're in their mid 30s. This is not a young couple. Like they've been married for 10 years and they've been through a lot of crap together. And over time, the tiny little holes that you have in your marriage, the tiny little things that you kind of look past and you're like, yeah, this is not a big deal, those little holes started to become like these gaping crevices, which created this gap between them, and they're trying to bridge that gap. So with those, like, that gap kind of becoming bigger and bigger, obviously they get pushed away from each other. The start of the story, in fact, this is not really a spoiler, this happens, like this information is dropped in the first chapter. The two of them have not seen each other for 7 months because of a fight. And so they're very, very much estranged at the point of divorce, very much right at the beginning of the book, that you kind of get dropped into. And the entire journey is to kind of get back to each other. Of course, like while they're trying to save their world and survive and make sure that their world doesn't crash, their city doesn't crash into jungle storms, and they have to work together to do that. But isolation and loneliness, I think, is very much embedded within that, because I think, again, you have to take a step back. When you feel isolated and you feel like lonely, that first thing comes from an acknowledgement of loneliness and understanding that I am now suddenly separate from society, world, family, relationships, whatever else. And then comes, the question of why. Is it me or is it them? And I think that question of why is something that the protagonists very much suffer, because it's not an easy answer, right? It's not just, oh, he's wrong all the time, or she's wrong all the time and it's her fault. It's very much a conversation. And I find this is what is interesting about monsters as well. You kind of look at it from that lens. It is a conversation. It's not a definitive. I'm not sure I engage very much in definitive questions and definitive answers in fiction. The kind of fiction that I write, it's very much a matter of perspective, and it's a matter of who is looking at that and what is the lens and what are the biases, and what is their life experience and what is their history and the stories that they have been telling themselves, or the stories that have been told to them, that is making them think in this particular way. So loneliness, even though it seems like this small little, you're kind of in your little room, in your little cave, and it's all dark and everything is cut away from you. I actually think loneliness is a much broader question, because suddenly you see, what are the things that I'm not engaging with? What are the things that are making me lonely? Why am I feeling like this? Why am I cut off? Whose fault is it? And can I fix it? And these are questions that Hilya and Ravan very much grapple with when they're trying to return to each other, within the story, because they have to understand why they got to that place in the very first place. And that small personal question is something that also defines like their understanding of the world, obviously, and their understanding of history, their understanding of their people, their understanding of the magic system, their understanding of survival, and why they're up in the skies in the first place, trying to run away from these jungle storms. Because you have this planet and you have these cities which are kind of isolated and have their own little, civilizations, and there's multiple cities, but each city is quite isolated in itself. So that theme of loneliness and isolation is very much like fractally, all across the book and across the series, I want to say. It's Ahilya and Aravin's loneliness and isolation with each other. It's each of their isolation with their own histories and their own past. It's their, planets, their cities' isolation and loneliness when it comes to the planet, right? It's society's isolation, given that all these cities, as many as there are, they're not like they don't have land borders like we do in our world. They're very separate, and they have their own little ecosystems, and they come together once in a while. So there's many layers of this. And again, like with the rest of the themes I kind of went into it, it's not necessarily something I designed right from the beginning, but after like copious writing and editing and everything, at the end of it, when I kind of look at the book, I'm like, that's actually pretty cool. Like, whew, I'm glad that that came across. Like, I didn't design it deliberately, but it's a nice thing that it did come across like that. So it's pretty cool. Like, even if I say so myself, like I find, the fractalization of all these scenes and how Ahelia and Aravan embed and personify all of this survival and loneliness and power and all of these things, in their relationship and with each other. I find that like really cool in the story.
Yeah, I think you guys both said that really beautifully. I'm gonna try my best to follow up, but uh, basically, with loneliness is a very big factor, at least for Elwood. In the very beginning, you see him when he runs away from his family. In a way of doing that, he's run away from, since there's a connection with his family in the church. He's run away from his sense of spirituality, his family. He has this very loose um, alliance. It's not even a friendship anymore with Will. So there's a scene in the beginning where Will's run off to he's bleeding. He came to the hotel bleeding. He has to get new clothes, but he's just sitting there in the shower by himself, thinking about everything that he's lost in the last 24 hours. And it's mixed with this heavy sense of confusion because of, I'm trying not to spoil it, but like what he overheard that caused him to run away. And it's this isolating moment where he's there by himself thinking about really what does he have left. He doesn't have his parents, he doesn't have his congregation, he hardly has Will. And he just feels like he's just kind of like this like meteor just floating off just away from everything else. And it's very tough for him to grapple with. And even as his relationship with Will mends and gets better, it's definitely strained. And there's only so much when the monster itself is an internal issue. It's not as much like, oh yeah, there's a giant monster in the woods. It's more of like an internal, like something's inside of him that adds a separate layer to his feeling of entrapment and his worry that he's almost like this breaking cage, that he's someone dangerous that he doesn't recognize when he looks in the mirror. And that also has him pull away from Will a little bit as well, because he's scared of hurting someone unintentionally because he doesn't recognize who he is. And that disconnect of looking in the mirror and not knowing what's inside of you, who you have left in your corner. It's a very strong, like it's very lonely for him to go through. um and in Will's corner, she's dealing with that sense of grief and that feeling. She's very rebellious. She thinks she's got no one that she can lean on but herself. um, and in that, she's very reluctant to let anyone in, and there's a loneliness aspect there too. So it's just these just two sad lonely people just meandering through the book. But yeah, it's a big part to it, and I think it definitely adds, with horror, when you feel like you've got nowhere or no one to turn to. It really heightens the emotions with that.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for these answers. I always feel I felt this way after the ending of the first Monstrosity panel too. But I always feel like you've all unlocked something in my brain when I finish these, and I'm like, wow, I feel just like I can look at monsters in a new way. I have left everyone's book description. Sorry, their well, not their book description. The book links in the description box below. So definitely, please add those to your TBR. Pre-order that. Sorry, not pre-order them. Order them, and also request them at your library. Do all the amazing things with them. Thank you to everyone who was watching. Thank you to my amazing panelists. And I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day with some great monsters in store for you in the future.
Thank you,